lecture. I'll start by thanking our sponsors. It's sponsored by Hermione and Luigi Grassi. Thank you very much, Hermione and Luigi. Hope you're here. Are you here somewhere? I can't see you. Yep. The speaker tonight is Elizabeth Pilliod from the University of Rutgers University, New Jersey, where she's a professor of art history. She did her postgraduate studies at the University of Michigan with a PhD on Alessandro Lori, who was the third of the trio Pontormo, Bronzino, and Lori. So you'll hear lots about them tonight. Her research is all about the connectivity between different artists from the Renaissance period, and derives from extensive work researching the multiple historical archives here in Florence. So she's in Florence a lot and is a real expert. This is another of our lectures which comes straight from original research. Will always good value. She's also involved in putting together important exhibitions. The Bronzino exhibition in Florence and New York in 2010, and more recently in 2021 at the Met in New York, a exhibition of Medici portraiture. So that's Elizabeth Pilliod, and I pass the word to you. Thank you very much.
Oh. I hope you can hear me. Yes, you can. Thank you so much, Simon. That was very kind of you. I'm going to assume that not everybody is a world expert on Pontormo, and even more specifically, not on the subject of this lecture. So do forgive me if I give you a little bit of background. I'm showing you the cover of my earlier book, and as Simon said, I've worked on all three of these artists, and this has really been the pattern of my entire career since I was a graduate student. And it really has repaid me richly because all kinds of things that other people never noticed, I did, because I wasn't just focused narrowly on one artist alone. That was the pattern of old art history. The sort of monographic approach, which of course is incredibly important, but the interstitial material sometimes can be very neat. This lecture focuses on the book that I published at the end of 2022. You're looking at the paper jacket unfolded so that you see the front cover, which has Pontormo at San Lorenzo, and the back cover. And one of the things that I did, and I'm so pleased the publisher did this for me, is that what you're looking at are drawings, right? You can see very clearly two drawings, but the drawing on the right-hand side of the screen is the recto of the same sheet of paper on which the back cover of my book is the verso, which is a portrait of Cosimo I as a young man by Pontormo. Then one of the images from the lost frescoes at San Lorenzo. One of the reasons that I'm so pleased they did this, and the colors they picked are perfect, by the way, that I'm giving the designer all credit for that. But one of the reasons that this is important is it's one of the real proofs that Pontormo's ideas and paintings were definitely well known to Duke Cosimo, that there was no secrecy about them. And I will explain what I mean about that just in a minute. Okay. Here is Pontormo. Now, our main source, aside from documents for his activity, is the biography by Vasari in the Lives, Le Vite of Vasari. And this is the frontispiece, a woodcut portrait of Pontormo that begins it. And I've always noticed that if you compare it to the woodcut portrait of Michelangelo, there are some significant differences. Michelangelo is in a brocaded cape with a fur-lined collar. Meanwhile, Pontormo has not been able to button his jacket correctly. That's why it's circled. Now, given that portraiture in this moment is not selfies from a phone, this has to be deliberate. It is not that, oh, he left it unbuttoned and Vasari took a snap and, oh, it was unbuttoned, sorry, I got you at the wrong moment. This is one of the ways in which Vasari fashions a portrait of Pontormo that is not as positive as the one I have or that I'm going to present or have been presenting over my entire career. And why he does that partially is very simple. Vasari himself, very famous and one of the greatest art history writers of all time, I would grant, absolutely. He was missing from Florence in a lot of the years that Pontormo was the lead artist in town. He's just not here. So he doesn't know certain things about him. Then in 1555-ish, which is only about a year and a half before Pontormo will die, Vasari is in Florence and starts to become, he's not yet, but he starts to become the head artist to the Medici court. Basically, he takes over the position Pontormo had in the 1530s and 40s and until his death. So there might be a bit of professional jealousy. He wants to sort of diminish a little bit of what Pontormo does in order to aggrandize a little bit more what he does. And so instead of talking about, he does say many times that things Pontormo created were lovely or beautiful. He's also rather critical, and he includes weird stuff. By the way, weird is a technical art history term. Just so you know, everything I'm doing is by the book here. Okay, so what are these weird things? Well, he begins the life of Pontormo with a very complicated genealogy. And it doesn't lead to an aristocratic background. It actually is rather confusing. And basically tells you that Pontormo lost his parents. Then he had a sister, but she passes away too. And somehow he's in Florence from Pontorme, which is the origin of his name, Pontormo. And he attaches himself to various artists to learn how to become a painter. So he's sort of, he's homeless, if you will. This is not aggrandizing, to say the very least. Then he says that Pontormo's house, you would think why talk about his house? Well, he does. By the way, you should read this Vita because it's really, really interesting, the things that are in it. He says that the Pontormo's house was strange, that it was the casamento of fantasia, fantasticato. Why? Well, for one reason, because the topmost story didn't have a solid ladder to it. Pontormo would drop down a rope ladder and crawl up it if he wanted to go there. Now, in my first book, I spent a long time looking at houses in the Renaissance, going up and down the street Pontormo lived on, and he lived in an absolutely normal house. Every other house on the block is just like it. And one of the reasons you didn't have a stone staircase is every time you build one of those, right, you have to use quite a bit of the floor of wherever you start. So having no big staircase on the second floor, which is where people slept, meant you had the largest room with the greatest amount of space there. And that's why people did it this way. He also says, number 3 on my list, that Pontormo didn't really seem to care about money and he refused payment from people. This led later scholars to imagine that Pontormo was very poor. No. So I went into the archives and found, he had a retirement account, which is really forward-looking, frankly. And he had something even better than that. He had an account with the Hospital of the Innocents. He gave them 100 florins, which is a huge amount of money, by the way. I mean, it's like an average of about 7 years of salary for a basic workman. So it's not cheap. He gave them 100 florins, and in return, for the entire rest of his life, as long as it lasted, they had to deliver on a regular basis to his home olive oil, wine, and grain. I mean, that's really kind of smart. When he died, his house was worth quite a bit. Okay, another thing, he cooked for himself. Now, why this comes up in the life of an artist is a little hard to to account for. Then here we get going into what I'm going to talk about today, the lost frescoes in the choir of San Lorenzo. 3 pages are devoted to this at the end of Vasari's biography, and they're quite critical of the style, and he says he can't understand the meaning of them. He makes the claim that Pontormo was so obsessive, that's the modern word we'd put on. He doesn't use the word obsessive. But he was so focused that he sealed the choir shut for 10 years and did not allow a living being in that whole time. This is a manifest falsehood, which I proved in my new book, because by going through the archives of San Lorenzo, I've documented all the times people came in to sweep the floor. The canons came there to sit there many times each day to chant. That was their job. They're sitting right below where he's painting. You can't tell them to go away. It's their place, right? My favorite sort of fun fact is that somebody actually stole the hanging lantern from the roof of the choir. For all I know, maybe they availed themselves of Pontormo's scaffolding. And it was not sealed. Plus, there were many funerals held there, and a few people very close to the Duke were actually interred right in the pavement. So that's not true. It's interesting that he says that, though, and it led in the 19th and 20th, early 20th centuries to the idea that Pontormo was absolutely solitary person, that probably he was, as one famous scholar said, perhaps even, certifiably neurotic and eccentric, almost a clinical case. I think once you remove the falsehood, this has to be reassessed. And Vasari says he can't understand what the meaning of the frescoes are, but he knows that Pontormo was familiar with, he consorted with those who knew doctrine. And why do I mention this? With the boom in the discipline of the history of religion after World War II in this country, Italian scholars really looked into the stresses and fissures caused by Luther and all of the other new doctrines, of the Protestants and the Lutherans, etc., and others, Melanchthon, another person. And they found this comment and assumed it meant, as we get to the 1980s, that Pontormo perhaps was friendly with heretics. And that the reason these frescoes were not beloved is because they had crypto, Protestant, and or heretical content. And that is where he stands until my attempt here. I'm going to go back to this book. And this book contradicts all of those ideas used based on documents. So I show you a little picture of his house to go with the house plan here. We also have a fragment of a diary. I'm showing you a page of it right now. And this added another, if you will, problematic content to the historiography of this great artist, which is that many of the things that are written here have to do with what he is eating and how he feels. And earlier art historians, not knowing the history of diary writing and of medical practice in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, literally took this to mean that he was neurotic, that he was, sorry, I want to stop here, that he was completely neurotic, that he was focused on, in fact, it does in the diary once or twice, he even mentions, prepare yourself, a bowel movement. Now, actually, that's actually very important because it probably means that he's collecting a specimen to take to a doctor, which is perfectly in line with medical practices of the day. That was how things proceeded. So by the time we get to 1922, in the first English art history compendium, instead of being the great artists that we enjoy in Santa Felicita, the leading exponent of Mannerism, Pontormo is under the section, if you look over here on the upper left, wherein the Renaissance perishes amidst the ruins. He's a failed artist. And that's because the kinds of things I just outlined to you in Vasari's lives are taken as 100% factual. Okay. And of course, that obsession with his body worked very well with Freudian ideas. So we have a picture of an eccentric, neurotic, solitary person whose last commission is a failure. Well, actually, if we go back in time and we ask ourselves, what did they think of this at the time? If we go to Santissima Annunziata and we go inside the chapel of the artists, and we look at this right in the center of the floor, the sculptor Montorsoli had left money for a place where artists who did not have family tombs could be entombed. And when that was ready in 1563, completely finished with this beautiful carving on it, on the lastra tombale, Pontormo was given the incredible honor of being the first artist ever to be buried here. In a ceremony that involved hundreds of people, they went and disinterred him from the side he'd been buried in. They walked him around the church and then back into it, carrying his coffin, and he was ceremoniously placed here on a special day, the day of the Feast of the Trinity, which was the day of his birthday, and also the day of the most important feast celebrated by the artists themselves as per the instructions for the creation of this tomb. What does that mean? That means he was considered extremely important. He was honored. So wait a minute. So they didn't all think he was a failure, did they? They couldn't have, or they would never have done this. Okay. So Here I show his, again, the Vasari against a rather nicer portrait drawn by his favorite pupil and good friend, Agnolo Bronzino, in the Uffizi. And I think while he's dressed as an artist and has a belt made of cord, so it's very simple, humble clothing, do note how he sits erect and stares off into the distance. He does not look distracted or confused. He looks noble. And I think that's more the way he was seen in his own lifetime and at his death. Now, San Lorenzo, when we look at it today, this is what you see, which is the 18th century view. The frescoes covered the end wall and the side walls, and they were removed by order of the electress, Louisa, because the walls were crumbling and had to be shored back up. They were therefore destroyed, although at one point, a few of them were in the Riccardi family collection. Apparently, they saved some pieces, some fragments. And I'm showing here also, so you remember, do recall that Cosimo I il Vecchio is buried right at the base of those stairs. This is the essentially like a royal chapel. If we were in a realm of princes or kings, this space is that space for the Medici, and yet it's also visible to the populace. It's not the new sacristy and the old sacristy that were closed, that were locked. So it has, and remember the canons sit in it every day, over and over. So all kinds of audiences see these images. And that includes, for instance, when there's a big funeral. I'm showing a print here so you can see that they literally built, you see this pyramid covered with candles. Probably one of the reasons that the walls had some problems and the paintings were probably dirty is all that smoke, years and many funerals. This is a drawing by Bontalenti that shows this platform, which is the platform over here. They built it right on top of the choir stalls. And the court, il corte, sits in it, and the Duke sits on a little throne over here, etc., for all kinds of events. So again, it's not exactly closed off, I would say. Okay, so how did he paint this? Well, he probably used a scaffold that, like this kind, we're used to the idea that they have feet onto the ground, right? But they can't do that, remember? Canons, every day, over and over. This is the other kind, and believe it or not, it's the more common kind, which looks absolutely terrifying to me because I'm afraid of heights. So yeah, this would not be good for me personally. But you have some posts jammed into the wall, and you put a platform down on it. Therefore, everything can continue on the ground floor. It's fine. You probably don't paint when they're praying because you probably don't want to drop paint on them. And I'm sure that he got down and left for funerals. So this is how it looks if you had to paint it. It's about 69 feet tall. It's not small. And so we have two side walls. And the end wall. Okay, so we don't have the paintings, but we have drawings. And for instance, whoops, excuse me, I went. Okay. For instance, this is a drawing in Dresden, and it's Adam and Eve being thrown out of the Garden of Eden, which we know from literary descriptions is one of the scenes. I'm not going to run through the literary descriptions, but there are a couple of them, and they tell us what was there. Now, I'm showing, I want to get the visual on this is this drawing is this big, okay? Remember, it's 69 feet tall, and this is going in the upper register. So this is me a few years ago. I had a student make a life-size cartoon from that drawing because the dimensions are on that drawing. And as you can see, I'm holding his toe. Okay, so this gives you a sense, these are big, these are not tiny paintings. And everybody sort of has never thought about the reality of doing this because we've got drawings, you know, the biggest one we have is this big. And some of them are quite a bit smaller, like the one in Dresden. So this gives you a sense. He had to drag these up there. He stuck them on the wall. You can just imagine. He probably even cut them into different pieces to make it easier. So the only remnant we have that supposedly shows some of the paintings, and I'm circling it with the mouse here, is a print. And this print was made for the funeral of the King of Spain, Philip II, in 1598. And there was a huge funeral, one of many similar funerals in the Church of San Lorenzo. And it's a way for the Medici to show allegiance as well to Ferdinand and to the Holy Roman Empire, etc., which was very important to them. Now we're going to focus on this part because that's the only, notice that draperies cover the bottom, 2/3. And there's a great big coat of arms here of Philip II, by the way. And you can see exactly, you're looking, it's disegno quarto della testata della chiesa con il coro e l'altare maggiore. So you know exactly what this is. These prints were probably made as a kind of tourist memento for aristocrats to be handed out to them. Now, there's an interesting story to this. If you look, I'm going to go in on it now. Okay. The print, if you look at it, and it has Adam and Eve leaving the garden, Christ in judgment, but he's blessing. And here's the temptation of Adam and Eve, and you can see the little snake around the tree. I point this out because there's your temptation, there's your expulsion. One of the things about what's happened to how we understand these is that a great scholar in 1952 studying this thought that the print needed to be inverted. His reasoning was very sound, but he was mistaken. And in fact, this is Charles de Tolnay, who was part of the Casa Buonarroti and all of that, a great Michelangelo scholar who lived here. Part of what is so interesting is that de Tolnay wrote a long footnote in his article in which, no one does this, in which he says, I'm really concerned, I could really be wrong, I'm not sure what to do with this, because when I put it the way I think it should go, if you look at the figure of Christ here, his left hand is higher than his right. Christ cannot bless with his left hand, his sinister hand. And de Tolnay says, I'm really concerned. Almost everybody is left-handed, and I know that's wrong, but I don't know what to do. And the reason he said he didn't know what to do was the drawings that we have, like the Dresden one, and the one in the middle here is in Uffizi, by the way, for the center. We don't have the third one. It's because this is the way the drawings are. So he took the print and made it match the drawings. Let me go back. It's really easy. Look here at Eve, how she's bent. Here she is. There they are running out that way, okay? So he makes, and there's his left hand blessing higher than his right. See the two fingers? Okay. So his reasoning is very sound. He says the drawings are like this, so I have to take the print and make them match the drawings. Well, what I've been able to show, and I will not spell this all out, it takes a little bit of time, is that these drawings are not the last ones. Pontormo inverted them and then scaled them up. He made at least 5 different passes at every single one of these images. And of course, the idea of taking a drawing, so I make a drawing, right, like this of a hand, and then I invert it, so my thumb is this way instead of this way. This all comes from Leonardo. He advises that you do this in his writings. It's a great way to get more mileage out of everything you draw, right? Because now you have another composition and you can use it a whole nother way. Okay, so actually, if you put it the way it probably goes, which is this way, you have to invert the drawings. But now, instead of this, which by the way is counter to Western reading order, the first scene is here and the next expulsion comes later. That's also one of the things the Ptolemy was upset about. Instead, we can turn it around, and that's because of the coat of arms, and I circled it there. The coat of arms is absolutely correct as the print is printed. Let me come in on that. Here it is. You can see a rampant lion there, etc. That is exactly correct. Now, until fairly recently, and in fact, so recently that in my first book, this is a page from my own first book, I followed the Ptolemy like everybody else and see item 38 reproduced in reverse, because that's what everyone believes. And that is a classic scholar error. And I can do that because it's my own book, okay? That's my book that I'm critiquing here. In any event, what this means is the print's okay as it is, and I can prove it by comparing to, say, the coat of arms on official documents of Philip, or coinage, by the way, which is a pretty good one, I think. So you can see that that means that this is how we're supposed to look at it. Now, what does this do? In a nutshell, the people who are good, like Christ, are now right-handed, and we move from the temptation to the expulsion in the order we expect. And that's important because earlier scholars used the fact that the order was confusing to say, yes, Pontormo was crazy. He did something really impossible. No wonder people couldn't understand it. But that we can't use that reason anymore. Okay, so here we have now the way you would see this. Christ's right hand is higher. And what that does, this makes it easy for everyone to see. It switches those 2 pink scenes and makes the order more appropriate. And now it follows patterns established from the late 1200s forward. It doesn't negate them. This would take so much time, so I hope that you will indulge and believe what I say here. The other scenes, you see this Cain and Abel, Noah designing the ark, Moses with the books of the law, the deluge is here, benediction of the seed of Noah. I know you can read it for yourself, but I'm just sort of leaving the 4 evangelists, sacrifice of Isaac, and labor of Adam and Eve, resurrection of the dead. By the way, the resurrection of the dead is the front cover of my book that you saw at the beginning, okay? Now, looking at this and reading the subjects real fast like that, every other art historian before me said, these scenes look all kind of messed up. They're not going in order. I don't get it. And that's because, if I'm correct, and I'm fairly confident now, remember that San Lorenzo is a collegiate church and there are canons there. And the job of canons is actually not to perform masses. They're scholars. They study patristic texts. They actually hire priests to perform the masses that are required all over the church. And they had a huge library too, a very important one. What it seems to me has happened is that a complicated, from our point of view, but not so complicated if we were alive in 1545 or 1550, is that the scenes on the side walls correspond to the scenes that are connected to, and I'm showing, no, I always love to show this where it says not reproduction, and I've reproduced it for you. But we're looking at the readings for 5 Sundays before Easter. The readings for Septuagesima. The word is up here. I'm sort of showing it to you. And these, one of the readings is part of the Gospel of Matthew, and is known as the husbandman parable. Excuse me, I can't say it correctly. In which everyone, you probably know this one extremely well. It ends with the famous phrase, "The last come first, the first come last," and it's essentially about God, although he's hidden as a kind of headmaster, laborer, hires people in the morning, and then later in the afternoon, and then in the late afternoon, and then in the evening, etc. And when it comes time to pay them, he pays them all the same amount. And the people who've been there since before dawn complain, saying, "Wait a minute, we're here longer." And then he summarizes by saying that what matters, not how long, but what you have understood. Now, that's sort of what the parable says. But this, the readings, is a gloss, a comment, an exegesis from Gregory the Great. And this is the kind of book, in fact, this kind of book exactly that the canons had in their library, explains the parable. The parable is meant to explain to people the 5 ages of humanity. The first age, those that came and started work before the sun came up, were that's Adam and Eve. And you see, they just really were not able to understand the message of Christ. They were too simple. They weren't smart enough yet. But then in the second age, that of Noah, Noah became more enlightened, and that's of course why he built the ark and saved people. Then in the third age, Abraham, who showed not just that he understood, but he was willing to sacrifice his own son, so he showed the maximum of obedience. Then Moses in the fourth is really important because he's the first one who sees the face of God and is handed down the laws. The fifth age is the advent of Christianity till the end of the world. Now, that is supposed to explain the ever evolving and expanding and growing understanding of humanity, of the truth of Christianity. It's a really big idea, actually. And these scenes, the ones that Pontormo did, are exactly these ages: Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and then of course Christ. And I can show you a kind of scheme. Let me explain what this is. If you look at the first age, it's at the very top, and it's like when you're on an airplane and the stewardess says the exits are there. There's 2 here, there's 2 here. It literally flanks and bookends everything. Then the second age, oops, is on the left wall and has the deluge, of course, in it. Then you cross over to the third, you cross over again to the fourth, and then the fifth, which is important. Notice it settles as it falls down into the right, and it's of course very big at that age. And the manner in which it goes back and forth over the high altar area is deliberate and is the way the narrative structure, for instance, of Piero della Francesca, because it causes people to continually make the sign of the cross. So it's very important. That's deliberate too. Okay, where are we now? Well, here we are in the place where all this happened. And the key moment in which this happens and in which the parable and its exegesis were in people's minds, and it's appropriate, we're here now, was Holy Week. Particularly the commentaries interlaced into the readings that were read all through Holy Week leading up to Easter, which we've just passed. And that is also significant because there was, oh, I have to show you this, sorry. That is also, let me back myself up 1 second, please. That is also very significant. This image, which I took quite a few years ago, was deliberately taken by me the day before Easter when I could get into San Lorenzo. And what it shows is the way the light falls on that back wall. Now, forget the organ, put some paintings back there, okay? The windows have not been moved. And it's significant that where the light falls in the morning on Easter in San Lorenzo in the choir is, of course, this scene that I've drawn an arrow to, which is what? The temptation. That is scene number 1 in the whole narrative, and it kicks off the whole necessity for salvation, right? Because that's original sin. If they hadn't done that, there would be none of this. We'd all still be in the Garden of Eden. So Pontormo that's very clever and very just, that this highlights the beginning of this scene as people flock into the church. And why do they do that? Well, here we are in the church, and we could just pretend we can beam ourselves back to Easter Day in the 1560s or something like that, in which everyone was very excited, of course, Easter morning at dawn, because Christ rose from the tomb, and others as well. But the afternoon was important too, and this is somewhat forgotten. At approximately sundown, the church filled again. A wooden barrier was done down the middle of the nave, women on one side, men on the other. And the crowds were so big that some people couldn't get in. The documents say this. They had to hire burly men. They literally say that. 6 burly guys to kind of maintain order so nothing bad happens with this huge crowd. And why is there a crowd there? Well, I've turned around to look in the other direction now. Did you catch that? So here I'm looking at where the frescoes were. Now I've just turned around and I'm looking towards the door. And the structure over the door, which we now zero in on, because on Easter afternoon, the ceremony of the display of the relics of saints occurred in San Lorenzo. And guess what? This structure, it just looks, like some columns, an architrave, is by the greatest Florentine artist of all time, Michelangelo. Okay. Very few people notice it even today. we think Michelangelo, we think the new sacristy. Remember, that's locked. You can't go in there. This is the only architectural monument by Michelangelo we could have seen, average folks like us. And what happened was the eldest prior, the prior or the eldest of the canons would walk up a staircase in the wall, come out on the balcony, and hold up beautiful vases, some of them with crystal so you could see the relic inside it, which were, he would then intone the name of the saint and its relic in both Latin and Italian so that we could understand if we didn't know Latin. And why did so many people come to this? This is interesting because all you had to do was see the relic or hear the name of the relic, and you automatically received a plenary indulgence. What does that mean? It means that if on your way out the front door, a stone from the church falls on your head and kills you, you go straight to heaven. You don't go to purgatory. Every sin you ever committed is gone. So of course there were huge crowds. And it was a reset. They hit the reset button. They got to start over with their sinning. Or they probably didn't think of it that way. And I'm just showing you one of the vases. These are also significant because the most important ones were from the collection of Lorenzo the Magnificent de' Medici, and the balcony and the ceremony were the product of another Medici, Clement VII, Pope Clement VII de' Medici. So we should imagine that this interacts with the paintings on the end walls that we don't see, in which we see masses of dead bodies that have been dead for hundreds of years, thousands of years, and then they rise. This is what the descriptions tell us. They rise because what? They're saved. And you and I, or the people, we're standing in between relics that are going to save us, and they're of saints, right? So those are figures already in heaven, but these are their physical remains, very powerful, and they are saving you. Meanwhile, you have behind you a whole explanation of the 5 ages of the development of the understanding of the truth of Christ, and your resurrection is even going to be shown, as in this image here, in which the figures are waking up, and the motif of the arm over their faces is because they haven't seen light for so long it hurts. They're just waking up again after thousands of years. And so the paintings were in dialogue with Michelangelo's reliquary balcony and that ceremony, a ceremony that had been initiated by Pope Clement VII back in the 30s, with objects like relics even collected by Lorenzo the Magnificent. And we as populace had the opportunity to receive an incredible gift at the hands of the Medici. And Cosimo, young Cosimo, who is paying for all this and supporting this, has very cleverly attached himself to Lorenzo the Magnificent, to Clement VII, and shown how the salvation of all Florentines is actually being furthered by the Medici themselves. It's a strong message, a very strong message. And I'll stop right there.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was a fascinating tour de force. Um, I we'll now do the question and answer, the usual format. In the room, if you want to ask a question or make a comment, please raise your hand and I'll bring you the microphone so that the people on the Zoom can hear you. And those of you who are with us on Zoom, you can place your question or comment in the chat and I'll read it out on your behalf. Or if you're feeling bold and want to talk to us direct, just unmute and we'll hear you in the room. So let's see what's going on in the chat. Not a lot yet. Okay, anyone want to go first? Here we are.
Thank you. That was really fascinating. I didn't know any of what you were talking about before you told us, so I've learned a lot. But I did want to know, you said that some of the fragments of the frescoes were in someone's collection. Has anyone seen those?
This is a great question, and I have been looking for them for years. So I have a feeling they had not survived. But what I can tell you is that the electress gave them to one of her favorite courtiers, and we know that he installed them in a suburban villa around the proscenium of his in-house theater. And I talk about this a little bit in the book because what that probably means, I can't prove this because I don't have them, but what it probably means, because we're in the 1740, there's a fascination with at that point with the doctrine of the affetti, emotions, and people's faces and how they express emotion in their faces. So the idea, you have fragments. It's clear that they were then cut into circles, put into medallions, and then installed around parts of this theater drama, so that that actually is a nice place for them. And probably they were faces, for instance, of people coming alive, which would be extremely expressive, or terrified in the deluge, things like that. So that's what I know about them. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Can I ask you to come onto the camera so people can see when you're talking? Okay. All right.
Of course.
Anybody else in the room want to go? We've got the same question on the Zoom about the fragments from David and Anne Wilkins. Also, Sarah's put up the usual reminder to Zoomers to make your contributions. It's in the chat, the link. Very grateful for that. Any more in the room? I've got one whilst you're having a think. You've done all this comes from a lot of research in the archives. You read 10,000 documents and you're finding little bits and pieces. Did you find any eyewitness descriptions of what the frescoes looked like in terms of the color and the sort of general vibe of them?
Those are not though in the archives. Those are in those are in descriptions, Vasari, okay, and then after him, Francesco Bocchi, and then there's a manuscript in the Biblioteca Nazionale that gives a slightly different description, and that's how we know what the episodes that were there, and some sense of their placement on the walls as well. That's how we know. But what I don't have is say a passerby, an average person describing them. That we do not have.
And in terms of I'm just trying to find a way into trying to imagine what they look like. In terms of the chronology of it all, the famous frescoes, beautiful frescoes at Santa Felicita, is it around the same period or?
These are later. Okay, so very good question.
So do the frescoes at Santa Felicita give us maybe a way into thinking what they might have looked like?
I think inevitably that, because if you look at some of the bodies, poor Pontormo, because we have Santa Felicita, which he finished in 1528. He worked at two Medicean villas and painted important things in loggias there, which were completely destroyed. We don't have a thing except a few drawings of those. And what does that mean? That means that we hop like 10 years into the future before we have the next images, which are only, unfortunately, the drawings for this. So we don't have them. We have some portraits that he painted in that period, but remember that portrait painting is its own genre, and it's not, quote, history/religious painting, which is what these are. And the rules and approaches are quite different. So we unfortunately do not have good comparisons for this except in drawings. So colors, I can't tell you. Now, Vasari does mention things about the colors a little bit, but more or less, he says that they're, quote, strange, close quote.
Weird.
Weird.
Yes,
Yeah.
another question in the room.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you very much. That was terrific.
Thank
The scale of these things, is this a one-man show? I mean, is he operating by himself? And then the second question would be, after everything's taken down and it's plastered and all that, is there a record of a decision not to redecorate?
Okay. Good question. So the first question, is it a one-man show, or how does that work? And this is something else Vasari says. Remember how he says it's sealed for 10 years? This is fed in to some art historians saying he was a really slow painter. Okay, we have to back that up a little bit. Remember, those cannons are in there many times a day. There are so many interruptions. Plus, with fresco, as you probably all know, you can't really do a good job frescoing if it's November and it's pouring rain and it just falls off the wall. There are times of the year that are not appropriate. So first of all, the idea that he took forever and did it all alone they're intertwined. He had an assistant who, and there's payment records for this guy, named Bastiano del Gestra. And I found payments for him. He got a big lump sum after the job was done because he was owed a bunch of back pay. Also interesting, the Duke paid for this student, this assistant, to have a workspace, to rent a room, basically attaccato, basically touching the side of San Lorenzo. And that's another documentary discovery. Why? Why is the Duke paying? Because they're storing materials in there. They probably do the cartoons, they got paints, they got this, they got that. Definitely he's working on this project as well. I have tentatively even suggested a couple of drawings that are copies after lost bits might be by this student. He might have had to make drawings to then help scale them up into cartoons. And final point, in Pontormo's own words, in his diary, he talks about some of the little figures, those little drawings in the margins, and he says that this one here is to be made up into the cartoon. I'm very much paraphrasing. Don't quote me. The way he says this, the actual exact words, make it very clear that he's not turning them into the big scale cartoons. Somebody else is, his assistant. And the second part of your question was, remind me quickly.
Is there a documentation on why they decided not to reject?
Well, there's a lot of documentation regarding the insertion of the organ. And it's also because when this happens, the fashion, right? We're mid-18th century. The fashion is for white with a little bit of gold trim. The whole, even frescoes in cupolas, okay, but that's when so many frescoes also were lost in Florence. They're whitewashed. They're, things from the Trecento were found to be clumsy, and they wanted the white, the pristine, open look. But also, like at Santa Felicita, that's all completely a product of that aesthetic moment. So that's why they don't discuss repainting it. Yeah, thank you. You bet.
There's one on the comment there. Yeah, is there, from David and Anne Wilkins, is there evidence the fresco cycle was completed, or was it left incompleted and stuff?
Yeah, good question. Thank you, David. There's quite a bit of information about this as well. So the Pontormo dies on the first day, on January the 1st, 1557. His student, Bronzino, finishes it. We know that from Vasari. We know that from these other textual sources. The exact part that he finished is a strip about 3 feet tall that ran along the bottommost part, right on top of the choir stalls. That's what he finished. And that can be corroborated by payments and drawings by Bronzino, and even, and this brings me back to my childhood, by Alessandro Allori, because when Bronzino has to finish, Allori is his pupil and is assisting him for sure. Then they were unveiled in time, shortly before the Feast of St. Lawrence in 1557. So from Pontormo's death, 6 more months and they were done.
Okay, good. Right, any more for any more? I think we're perhaps getting towards wine time. The last night of the Carfaggio beautiful red wines tonight before we move on to Rufino tomorrow. It's all about wine at the Institute. Sorry, Zoomers, you have one on us in the privacy of your own home. Lovely to have you with us. See you all again next week. So the thanks to Hermione and Luigi for the sponsorship, and particularly to Elizabeth for a beautiful lecture. Thank you very much.
Thanks.